Andrew, thank you very much for agreeing to do this. It's much appreciated.
Well, in a way, it's a bit of a privilege. I take it. I certainly take it seriously.
That's great. Okay. Well, I have a list of questions that I tend to work through, but there's no real set structure. If you feel you want to go off and talk about something else, please feel free to do so.
No worries.
Okay. So can we start off by asking for your name, your date and place of birth, as well as your current status?
Well, the latter is a little bit more complicated, but certainly the first. My name is Jim Freedman, and I was born in in Nashville, Tennessee, in the southern part of the United States, in 1944. And as for now, I many years ago moved to Canada, and so I'm really Canadian. And so I taught in university for a number of years, and then I quit and became an independent writer and consultant. And so I still do that.
Okay, that's great. So can you tell us what brought you to France in 1968?
Well, I mean, there were probably zillions of things, and I'm sure the answers are fun. But probably the first thing was, speaking of fun, it was really because I was attracted to structuralism as a philosophy and as an approach to social science. And so, I mean, and to be perfectly honest, for me, the scholarship in France is fun. It's imaginative, it's fun, and people take it very seriously. It was never the case in the United States, where I was going to school, or Canada. If people who are interested in gambling, they go to Las Vegas. That's their destination. In those days, if you really wanted to, France was your destination. So, I mean, that was probably the first thing. And I had an excellent opportunity to help somebody write a book. And so I was working in the Bibliothèque Nationale. And, well, it was a marvelous thing to do at that time of life.
I'm sure it was. Had you been to France before?
No, I had been to Europe, but I had never really spent much time in France. But I'd always known, and to be perfectly honest, I don't know how, but I had always known that that's a place I wanted to be. I was carrying on as an academic, as part of in postgraduate programs, possibly mainly because of the Vietnam War, to stay away from the draft. But I mean, it was a real fun enterprise for a half-baked intellectual in those days. So I mean, that's sort of what I was. I mean, I saw the possibility of being a writer, and France was the place.
So what was your employment in 1968 in France?
Actually, I had a job doing research in the Bibliothèque Nationale for a biography of Félix Éboué, who was the first Black governor of Guadeloupe. It was a marvelous book, and it wasn't my book; it was his. But he employed me to do research in the archives.
Okay, and so where were you living in Paris?
In Paris, first of all, I stayed up in the 9th, 9e arrondissement, not far from Pigalle. But it really wasn't the best of circumstances. And so at some point I moved down to very close to Odeon, and had a place on the Rue de Seine.
Okay.
Lived in a dumpy hotel. Best place I ever lived.
So prior to 1968, would you describe yourself as having been politically or socially active?
Well, I mean, it's a very interesting. I saw the question on the limit. It's certainly in the sense that I mean, it was very difficult if you had been well educated, I think, and not to be opposed to the Vietnam War. So that was like around everybody. But I had grown up in the South, United States, and in a place where there was the first sit-ins, Greensboro, North Carolina, and I was very much part of the civil rights movement, and so there were these two issues to which I was very committed. Although I didn't go out on the streets and protest, but it certainly was. I mean, so I was politicized on those matters. So the answer is yes. And then in undergraduate university, I was the editor of the student newspapers. I tended to speak out on the odd occasion.
And going further back, I mean, is there anything in your family and your upbringing that made you politicized, or?
Chris, well, I mean, maybe, but I'm not so sure. My father was a Russian intellectual, and in the 1920s and 30s, he was not say 30s, in the late 1920s and early 30s, he was a communist. He was a communist in the United States. My mother worked for Franklin Roosevelt. So, I mean, they did have that. And it was a great house to grow up in. They were great. They were great people. My father then became an arch conservative for whatever reason. Whether it was McCarthy or whether it was because of his own skepticism or because he was a Russian intellectual. All of those might have been attributed to him. But it was a household in which political issues did matter.
Okay. So when you're in France and before things kick off, was there a sense that something was coming?
Absolutely not.
No.
Nope. No sense of it all. I was in the seminar. I was in Lévi-Strauss's seminar, and that was absolutely marvelous, but it had nothing to do with politics. The other seminar that I was in, luckily, was Georges Ballandier, who, for me, he was a great politologue, but there was we were talking about African politics, and they were great courses, but there was no. But in fact, I think everybody would agree that the Soixante-Huit Arts all agree really that the thing happened almost suddenly. It sprung up in a place where nobody would have expected, at Nanterre, and it was a reaction to these Fouché reforms, which I don't know, nothing, but it really did tap all of a sudden a political nerve in France that I think people didn't anticipate.
Was there any sense, as someone from outside of France, was there any sense that there was an international zeitgeist going on, that maybe things, whether it was Vietnam, Germany, whatever, civil rights, was there not a sense that internationally there was things were beginning to move?
I don't know. I have to say, I wasn't particularly aware of it. I mean, being a student in Paris and working because, you take it seriously, you work like a dog. And you're not very comfortable because it's a tough way to live. And I didn't have a lot of money. I mean, I guess certainly de Gaulle Week was very famous for hosting the peace talks for Vietnam in Paris. Well, okay. I mean, but it attracted a lot of attention. But I don't think there was any international geist there that had anything to do with provoking these events. I don't think so.
And what about culturally? We look back on this period in terms of fashion, music, and clash of generations and that sort of. Was there any sense that there was a new generation coming through with a different set of demands?
Well, I kind of expected you might pose the question. It's good. I mean, obviously, it's a great question, but I mean, this was the 1960s, so. There was that, and Colombia was in foment, and Pierre Trudeau had just come to power in Canada. I mean, what a great guy! And so on the other hand, there was Lyndon Johnson. I mean, certainly there was a political awakening in my life, but I don't think it would be accurate. Well, I don't know. But I don't think it would be, for me, it wouldn't be accurate to say that there was a political awakening happening in Paris or in France. Though one always has to be aware that unlike other countries, I don't know any other country like this, the issue of the philosophy of one's government and polity is always just under the surface. I mean, there's always a concern, as most people know. And there's a high sensitivity to having the correct political configuration. So that's always there. Was it particularly heightened? Only modestly. in my view.
Okay.
But I think it's more important, and Chris, to keep in mind that what happened was pretty much unexpected.
Okay. That's
And
great.
more interesting on that, and for that reason.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So when things start to kick off, how did you start to experience the events then?
Well, first of all, there was a group of people there from I had known from my undergraduate days, brilliant radicals. One of the guys was studying with Marcuse and stuff like that. You've probably already talked to Andy Feenberg. And well, I mean, we did talk about politics all the time. And so there was that. But no, I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know. What's the political atmosphere? It's hard to say.
So how did you start to realize things were happening? What happens?
Hearing about Nanterre. Everybody read Le Monde. People came to know who Cohn-Bendit was. We understood the problem of the Fouché reforms. It was not a nice thing. And I think there was one other thing. I mean, the Fouché reforms was really trying to make education more efficient. This is not what education is in Paris, and certainly not in France. So that was, and I think that was, quite annoying. But I think I would say there was one more thing, and that was when the opposition to the Fouché reforms occurred in Nanterre. The administration's response, I can't remember the guy's name, was it Dean Grappin or something? Yeah, I can't remember, but the response was nuts. It was nuts. I mean, they would try to squelch it. That was not a good idea. That was one thing. And then the other thing was that there was this guy there who was so good at all this. I mean, he could have taught the Occupy movement a thing or two, may I tell you. But Daniel Cohn-Bendit was a smart guy. And I think he mobilized things in a way that if he hadn't been there, it probably wouldn't have been quite as successful. But the fact of the matter is, once it got started, it was very hard to resist. Now we're talking about the first week. So that's the first thing. But once the crackdown occurred, and once it became very obvious that the Minister of Education was going to, try to really put this thing down in a grotesque and tough way, that was it. Then it was ready to explode. And
what was your?
We were living down near the Sorbonne, and I mean, you couldn't help but get caught up into it. Yeah, sorry.
What was your involvement? How did you experience it on a day-to-day?
Oh, you mean on the events?
Yeah.
I went into the streets. I agreed fully with Cohn-Bendit. I attended almost every one of the occasions at the Sorbonne when Cohn-Bendit took the main stage, when Jean-Paul Sartre came and gave a talk. Other people, Servan Schreiber came on. Holy Moses, this was interesting. I mean, it was really interesting. And then something happened toward the second week, I think, of the events. I was in a march, and basically it was a student march, but a lot of people, and we got hit by lacrymogène, by tear gas. I will never forget it. It would change my life. And when you get hit by like something like that, and you get hit by police, it's really unusual, and particularly someone like me, not particularly. I'm not a rabid revolutionary, but then after that, I was ready to hit the streets. So I think that was the turning point for me.
And did that change your involvement? Did you become even more involved then?
Oh yes. I mean, and then my friends who were associated with Marcuse, and other people, and all of a sudden they're gravitated around us, both people from all over, from Germany, people from France, some of my friends in Bellangier's class, and then all these people created a bit of a group. And we met quite frequently. We talked, And then Andy Feenberg and I decided to write a book about it. So that was more or less in the third week. Things were still going on. And so we were both in the streets and at the typewriters.
Okay, so you spotted straight away that this was something that needed to be written about.
Yeah, I mean, there was absolutely no question about it. And there it is. Of course, the book was actually bought early on, and by a pretty good radical publisher. But they then decided sometime in August, finally, that they wouldn't publish it. But it was published subsequently by a university press in New York.
Can I ask you some specifics that might open up other things? So
absolutely. I mean, this is marvelous. This is great fun to talk about it. I mean, let me simply say very briefly that I think for everybody who was involved, it was a life-changing experience. It was very difficult not to be changed by these events.
Yeah, we'll get on to some of that.
All right.
From your perspective later, but I just want to ask a few details about the events themselves. So one of the big discussions around 68 is the idea that there was an attempt by students to strike up stronger relations with the workers. And I wondered if you had any experience of that, and if so, how much of it was successful or unsuccessful?
Well, that was the big question, in the third week. The CFDD and the CGT and those guys, I didn't get involved in it because I didn't want to go down to the factories. First of all, I didn't want to get beat up, but also I was more interested in the way the student and what Daniel Cohn-Bendit was doing, what was happening at the Sorbonne. I was very interested in the ideas that were coming out of it, but I think yes, but certainly the tension that surrounded whether the workers would join the students or not was fascinating. It was fascinating theoretically because that really made it a Marxist and a communist issue. It was fascinating culturally to see two different styles of protest. One protest based on wages and conditions of work, and another style based on cultural issues come together. And they did. They really did. In a way that say, let's just compare it to Occupy. It never happened in Occupy. I mean, it never extended beyond the discontents. Even though I liked it very much, it just never went very far. But certainly in Paris, there was the tension around then, and then it happened. Holy Moses, that was pretty wild.
Okay, great. One of the other characteristics that's often discussed about 68, and I suppose it's picked up in your book, is this sense of quite a strange phenomenon that's often summed up by the term la prise de parole. And I wondered how much you experienced this prise de parole and what you thought of it and how important it was.
You mean by the students?
Yeah, and these ongoing debates and discussions that they had, but also if it extended beyond the walls of the occupied faculties.
Yeah, I mean, I think at some point the students, tasted blood. I think that when so many institutions, when Khan closed down and committed themselves to this, when the medical students walked out of the medical school, I mean, really, and walked into the streets and started taking care of people who were hurt. One of my best friends was badly injured by the police. When the Théâtre d'Odeon, for example, just declared themselves in the service of, then you realize that an entire cultural thing was happening, and and then you realize that you were in the midst of something pretty phenomenal. And if that was going to be a prise de pouvoir and parole, yeah, let's do it. one thing that was clearly there was it was at the same time a radical political event, but it was also a cultural event. So, everybody, people said, the understanding was that if you were going to be involved, then you had to change your ideas about things. And also that this was going to overturn not over the politics, but the way in which people operated in society. So, yeah, I think that was probably what made it truly unique. And there was a possibility that we were going to overthrow the government.
Was that one of the objectives when you think of the discussions that were ongoing? Was it on va refaire le monde, or we're going to reform le monde?
On va refaire le monde. We're gonna get rid of de Gaulle. We're going to put in place a mechanism that is humane, that listens to people, that allows freedom for people to do and think as they wish. And that was one thing, that the Fouché reforms really was against, because it kind of was an Americanization, which favored efficiency over ideas. And so, I mean, the protest was very successful on those matters. So yeah, it was going to be a cultural overturning of that society. And certainly the events around the world didn't discourage you from thinking that was a real possibility. So, yeah.
So on the events around the world, was there a sense of that this was part of something bigger than a French phenomenon?
There was, I think, because there were a lot of big issues around the world. But I think at some point, particularly since there followed protest, as you know, in the UK, then Belgians went on strike. Belgian students went on strike at, Université Libre de. And when all these things happened, we felt very much as if we were in the vanguard, I have to say. And we were. I mean, what was happening in Paris was really in the vanguard of this. And then it was only afterward that Mark Rudd did his thing in Colombia. Yeah, I mean, there was a sense that this was, we were in the head of in the vanguard of what was going on around the world. But there was a sense that it was connected. These things were connected, very much so.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned earlier the impact of the violence in a protest with lacrimogène, for example. I wondered if you had anything broader to say about whether or not 1968 could be considered as a violent revolt. What did you think of the level of violence?
I think that this is something that needs to be said. I think there was a lot of violence. Did anybody die? I can't remember. But I mean, does it have any, can we compare it to what's going on, let's say, in Congo right now when they're trying to oppose Kabila? Probably not. But we were, remember, kids from middle-class families, and people were beating up on us, seriously beating up on us, breaking our legs, breaking our arms, and making you choke with tear gas and where you had to go get treatment. I mean, that's violence, even though nobody's dying. So, yeah, and I think I was not, as I mentioned before, I'm not the only one to have been deeply radicalized, and I still am. And under I've been under the influence of those events and being hit and being hurt. I think that the violence really does have an interesting effect upon you.
You started off by saying this needs to be said.
Yeah, it does need to be said, because I don't think people appreciate it that much. There were, let's say, there was maybe two kinds of violence. First of all, there was the stupidity of Périfit. Really, I mean, the guy was stupid. He didn't really know what was going on, and he just thought he could stop it by bringing out the cops. And the deans was the rector Roche, same thing. All these guys were the same. That was one kind of violence, completely ignorant of what was going on and neglectful. But secondly, to bring out the cops, the flic, they became the other enemy, and you didn't, I mean, we were not shooting at them with guns, but we were throwing serious rocks at them. And I think that for many of the people who were involved, it was the violence, the senseless violence implemented against the students and the workers that really brought things to a head or changed people. And I mean, let's be honest. Here you are, 2016, and you're recapitulating what happened. Whenever I have been involved in, because I ended up having a career that took me around the world, and I met somebody of my more or less age who had grown up in Europe, and if you mention that you were a 68, there's an immediate bond. An immediate bond. I remember I was living in New York when the book finally came out, and I went down to Condé Nast Publishers for some reason, and I said, would anybody be willing to put get a map together for Paris? You guys have got these kinds of things. And they said, oh, why? What do you do? Well, we want to do something for this book, and for the movement in 1960s. Oh, you saw all these people all gather around. No, je suis 68. No, I was there, man. Here, free, no problem. Don't pay for this. Thumbs up. And I think, let me say that I may be overstating it. I have no idea. But I think that a lot of it was the prise de conscience that came about as a result of violence.
Okay, that's really good, interesting. I talked about an awareness of what was happening internationally. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you had any comment on what level of awareness you had of what was going on in France outside of Paris, so that this was more than just a Parisian revolt.
Well, not too much. I don't think we saw these events as well. Certainly, the opposition to the war in Vietnam. I mean, Lyndon Johnson was a terrible individual in many ways, and so and then there had been the Kennedy assassination, all that stuff, and the enormous discontent that you saw in the United States, and then the discontent in Canada that brought Pierre Trudeau, a socialist, to power. Yeah, I think people were aware of that, and so there was a sense that this was joining, maybe to some extent, but this was so remarkable that it's kind of stood on its own, if you permit me saying that.
Yes, of course, but I also wondered whether or not you were aware of similar types of revolts or rebellions happening elsewhere in France at the time.
Oh, at the time, yeah. I was aware of things that were happening in Avignon and things like that. But I didn't write about them, and because I didn't know much about them. So we all knew what was happening, in the factories outside of Paris. We all knew. Everybody followed pretty closely what was going on when students took to the streets in other cities. I think people felt that we were part of that in a way that was largely indistinguishable, but not deeply connected in the kind of way I think you're looking for. But I could be wrong. And I think if you talk to French students, you'd find that they would probably be more aware.
Yeah. No, it's just interesting I am interested in regional iterations of 68, and I think it's an important part of the story, but I'm also very interested to understand whether or not people who were in Paris were aware of that this was going on.
Yeah, people were aware. Yeah, I mean, certainly we're very aware when, Geste Libre de Bruxelles, they went on strike, and other universities around the world also, you would hear that they were going out in the streets, and so I think that was something we were aware of. but beyond awareness, I cannot remember. I'm sorry. I can't remember feeling, being particularly taken up by it or moved by it. And certainly it never came up in our book. Not much.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah,
What
yeah.
is, what is your assessment of the political elite in '68, whether it's de Gaulle, Pompidou, Mitterrand, Mendes France?
Well, with de Gaulle in power, it was a rigid and kind of a rigid, unimaginative, cartel, I would say, fueled by serious conservatism from various sources, and and by the vestige of his power from being a hero. But they showed themselves to be remarkably unsensitive to what was going on, and so that that made it even worse. And I think that I really genuinely think that it was around that time, almost in Europe and North America altogether, that people began to have grave suspicions about the good intentions of politicians. My father had become a great, supporter of conservative politics, and I can remember when Richard Nixon eventually was impeached. It was a great surprise to him, but it happened to us much earlier. It happened to us probably with the Kennedy assassinations, and this because you began to suspect that it wasn't just an assassination. So you began. So whether it was true or not, I really believe that people felt that this was part of a junta, a kind of a junta, which none of us could trust. So maybe that puts it into some kind of a language that is okay with, that was useful. And so there wasn't really any other way to get them out of power and to restore a reputable and government with integrity, except through street opposition, marching against them.
And what did you think of the Communist Party, or Mitterrand, or Mendes France?
Well, I'm not too good at that because I don't remember them all that well. I remember Mitterrand was on the left and very involved in the was it the CGT or the Socialist Party, if I'm not mistaken, which I'm probably not. But Mendes France was head of also had a big role in the workers. But then, by contrast, there was Pompidou, and so there were politicians on the right as well. But certainly, the Mendes France, a very prominent individual, had pretty much come over to our side to a large extent. So, but that gave it an enormous boost in credibility. I'm sorry, I can't do much more than that. I am not a student anymore of French politics, as probably you are, but certainly we lived it and breathed it in those days, and yeah, these guys were intriguing.
And how would you describe your feeling when everything came to a conclusion at the end of June? Was it a feeling of relief or disappointment?
Disappointment. First, oh, come on, guys. Let me say also that there were a couple of things involved, and I noticed that you had mentioned, I thought was perfect. Are you interested in its hedonistic aspects or its political aspects? Well, there was both. There was both. As I said at the beginning, the politics and the ideas and the action was super fun, super interesting. And you couldn't resist the excitement of a political event in progress, major political event. So it was very sad to see that thing fizzle out, because it was like rooting for, an underdog team, and then darn, it loses in the end. So I would say, many of us who were involved were genuinely concerned about making reforms and about introducing a kind of a cultural way of life and thinking that was a little bit more interesting than a bourgeois way of life. And I think we all learn that and carry it on in our different lives these days. Still, all my old friends from those days, they're all doing interesting things. So it was really sad that had to come to an end. And not only did it come to an end, but it came to an end in a very with the referendum in a very abrupt way. And I can tell you, it was, remember that period of time, there were all kinds of things happening. The workers of the electricity, combine were putting power on and off. Everybody was involved. And then all of a sudden it was in June, it was as if nothing had happened. And well, the only thing that was left was Andy and I were sitting in our hotel rooms and writing a book. It was extraordinary. And Marcuse was there. It was extraordinary, but it was sad.
Okay. Can you remember how your parents or your friends back home, what they thought of your involvement or being in France?
Nah, they were. I'm sure they thought it was. Oh, he's wherever he goes, there's something happening. I think they probably said that to themselves. Let him. Hope he doesn't get hurt. But I don't think that they were expressing any particular concern that about me.
So does trouble follow you around?
Well, we were all. I was always interested in getting things going, and certainly as the editor of the newsletter at the university, it was lots of fun. Get stuff going, but not in a frivolous way, really. I don't think. But who knows?
Maybe not a bad thing.
Yeah. Your questions are marvelous, Chris.
How did you perceive the impact on France at the time, and how has that shifted over the years?
Oh, that's probably a question for somebody a little bit more sophisticated in French politics than I am. And you can really become, and that's, as you probably know because you are, but that's an area that I think is very complex. And that's something I don't do. But France, after that, has really turned to the, to the right, and partly I think there are probably a lot of reasons for it, but it's a very different country now. And it's become very, very much more middle class, and much, and then of course immigration has meant people like the Le Pens come to have a pretty strong role in French politics. That's not good. That's not good. And there are people who say that, every 30 years, 40 years, that France purges itself and reawakens its political conscience, and perhaps it'll come again at some point. I think that probably would be very useful. but I think it's very much the only thing that's left of seems to me. Well, not the only thing, but is the memory.
Okay. So, do you think France needs another 68?
Well, times have changed. Certainly. There are remarkable changes now that certainly didn't exist then. Globalization is certainly one of them, and the globalization of conflict is one of them. That makes countries that in those days were going along a track that kind of never really deeply changed, now having to confront things that are very unique and that never confronted before. So maybe to say that things will continue as they had for 100 years in France is probably wrong. Certainly there's been no Leon Blum, no 1936. I don't think so. But again, I can't speak with a complete authority. Many of the people that or some of the people that I was with in those days, they've moved in their retirement years or close to their retirement years. They've moved to Paris and enjoy it and its lively intellectual atmosphere. But in my opinion, it's changed radically. And, when you used to, in the old days, you go to the Sorbonne and it was wide open. Walk into a class, walk into the theater, whatever. I went, I think about a year ago, I went back to the Sorbonne and it was locked, and they had guards, and things changed. I apologize on some of the matters that you've asked. I can answer, but on that matter, I think I'm on very soft ice.
So, how do you think that these events had an impact on how you understand France or understood France?
Absolutely.
In what way?
Well, I understood something about a country that has a political sensitivity just under the surface, and it's ready, and people are very concerned about it. People read Le Monde, people read Le Figaro, people read, and they want to know what was going on. It was very, very different from the countries that I grew up in. Very. And I admired it. And I wanted to live in a country like that. And I would have stayed in if I had been able to do that and not have been forced either to go to prison or go into the war. I intended to stay and stay in Paris. United States was not a very attractive place to live for that very reason. So I learned what was unique about France, and I think I was right about it. I couldn't do it, so I came back and did a PhD in the US and then moved to Canada.
And do you think that your experience of 68 affected your career choices?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I wanted to continue the lively intellectual atmosphere that I lived in Paris, both the events of 68, as well as being in Barandier's seminars, those wonderful, lively things. So I continued and stayed in the university and taught French anthropology and French politics for a while. And then I felt that this was not sufficient as far as my commitment to world humanity. And so the rest, I quit about 25 years ago and committed my life to writing and to taking consultations that in areas of conflict where I thought I could maybe make some interesting contributions. So it's that all comes, really, I tell you, I think a lot of it stems from my political awakening in the streets of Paris.
And do you think that experience also shaped what you've written? It's actually shaped what you're interested in from a scholarly point of view. Has it shaped that as well?
Well, there were probably other factors for that, but certainly it's been a contributing one. After that, I became very impatient with scholarly writing, and so I now what I write. I've written a number of books, but mainly what they're written in a very accessible style. Many of them are political, at least underneath the surface. For example, I was very intrigued. I was sitting in on the seminars of Roland Barthes. I don't know if you know. I'm sure you do. And I mean, I read his piece on the catch. So I kind of wrote a book that became quite well known on professional wrestling in Canada, with the same point of view, seeing it as a proletarian drama. So that gives you some idea. It's hard to go into that in depth, but the answer is a very resounding yes.
Okay, excellent. and you've already mentioned this several times, but I would like just to capture it again.
Mm.
How would you summarize the impact of your experience in 1968 on you personally?
Um, I would never have been as politically aware, uh, and particularly with respect to the insouciance of government vis-a-vis its people. I might have just let that one ride, but after France, never again. And I really take it very seriously when regimes like George Bush and regimes like Harper in Canada, Stephen Harper in Canada, really govern with a sense of entitlement that they don't merit. And I think it's really important I've always felt that it's important to oppose them. And I probably would never have done that if it hadn't been for, had that disposition, shall we call it, if it hadn't been for France. So and politically, yeah, I mean, I'm very, I'm aware in a way that I wouldn't have been before. Culturally and personally, Chris, it's the best time of life. It was wonderful. we didn't talk about the hedonism, and the cultural creativity, that just the power of it, the posters and the poetry and the events and the music and the release of a huge amount of cultural energy that happened during that time. But it was very much present, and you can never forget that.
You're making me very jealous. One of the questions I'm particularly interested in some of my writing on 1968 is to examine the sort of dominant narrative around 1968 and to ask the question as to whether or not the way in which the story is told today actually captures people's experiences of it. So do you have an opinion on the current dominant narrative of 1968, and how much does it sit with your own experience?
I saw, I was wondering about that question, and the problem with my answering it is that I don't know what the dominant narrative is. Probably I don't know. I have to say I really don't know.
Well, if I was to explain a little bit and say that I'm often critical of the fact that when the story of 68 is told today, there's quite a narrow focus on three things, which are Paris, May, and students. Would you say that captures your understanding or your experience, or is there more to it than Paris, May, and students?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, oh my gosh. Far more than Paris. And I think some of the things that I find myself saying, I'm listening to myself, I'm kind of intrigued. But I mean, I find is that, yeah, I mean, for many people who participated, there's a deep fear of insensitive political regimes. It's just not right. And I would never have, I mean, thank you, Alain Périfit, for that. I mean, that I was taught that was not only a danger, but wrong and hurtful to a lot of people. And goes way beyond Paris, way beyond France. And I don't know about May. But, well, if that's the dominant narrative. But I think also, it would be very unusual to find so many people united nowadays as the 68 Hours, who around something as somewhat limited as that, because these are life-changing experiences, even for people who were not in Paris. It was a very, I just finished a book on the International Criminal Court, and one of the interesting things was a story of a guy, a prosecutor from Belgium, who I happened to interview him because I was curious about the first trial there, and he represented the victims of this man, and he said he had this testimony about how 1968 completely changed his life and completely changed the way he and many of his colleagues thought about the law. That it should be in the service of people, it should be in the service of protecting people. And well, I think that answers the question. I mean, goodness knows how widespread that is, but I think it's relatively widespread, certainly in my experience. And certainly, if that's the dominant narrative, it doesn't come anywhere near to doing it justice.
Yeah, I mean, another element worth noting just before we move on to the last question was when you mentioned earlier on about the issue of violence, and you said this needs to be said. I mean, in the dominant narrative, if such a thing exists, that's just my assessment of it. In the dominant narrative, the violence of 1968 is often represented as no more than symbolic violence.
Not if you got hit on the head. It's not very symbolic. I mean, I think I would. I compare it, it was very intriguing with the Occupy movement, and there wasn't any violence there. Why? Because the police realized, now, they didn't know it then. They realized that one way to radicalize a population very quickly is to beat them up. Kabila doesn't know that, but he'll learn. And Nkurunziza in Burundi doesn't know that. Museveni doesn't know that, but they'll learn. And if they don't, then they're successful. That violence is a very instructional event, and that's one way to tell somebody that you're in serious danger as long as we're in power.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one more thing, which is the hardest probably, which is if you had 30 seconds to sum up your experience of 68, of what it means, how would you do it?
Yeah, well, I mean, from a personal point of view, from a political point of view, I think I've talked about it. But from a personal point of view, I would say that it gave me a perspective on cultural and political change and the possibility of it that has been with me all my life. And then, of course, it was the most fascinating and engaging period of my life. It's not to say that other things haven't been just as in a different way, but that was a good one, and I'm deeply grateful for it. So that's 30 seconds.
Okay, that's great. I'm gonna